Welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations. We're pleased to welcome to the program Mr. Terry Eastland. And Mr. Eastland is the Public Relations Director for the Department of Justice in the federal government. And Mr. Eastland, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Thank you much.
Complicated and difficult and high-pressure position you're in, being in a public liaison relationship with the Department of Justice. And I wonder if maybe you could share with me and the general cable audience the Department of Justice itself. It has an incredibly large responsibility in terms of the federal structure, and that responsibility is growing as more and more questions. The drug thing is coming under your purview and other things, but the Attorney General is the major law enforcement officer in the land. I wonder if we could share an overview, the overall arching responsibility of the Department of Justice, and maybe we could inform the citizenry on some of the responsibilities you're trying to keep up to pace.
Certainly. Maybe one way to best put it in perspective is this. The Office of the Attorney General was created in 1789 by an act of Congress. At that time, the act authorized the creation of the office and also one job underneath the Attorney General, a clerk, essentially, who kept firewood and managed the papers of the Attorney General. That's right. But since then, this office gradually has grown. In 1870, it became, by another act of Congress, an actual department. The Department of Justice was created in 1870. And from a very small office with an Attorney General and I think at that time 2 assistants, the office started to grow. And really the Department of Justice, the growth of this department into today an institution that employs 65,000 people.
Yes, indeed.
Some of them in posts around the world. This office and its growth, its development into a department reflects really the nature of the country itself. The country's own changes and developments. In the late 1800s, for example, we had the interest with antitrust. The antitrust laws were put on the books. So what happened? We had an antitrust division. We now have a litigating division that deals with cases brought under those statutes. In the late 1860s, we had, of course, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment.
That's right.
And all of the responsibilities that have resulted from that, many of them involve litigation that have involved the government. We have as well the beginnings of the criminal division with the passage of a number of federal criminal laws that occurred in the 19th century, and that occurred in the late 19th century. We had the creation of the civil division, the land and natural resources division, and of course in the 50s in this country we had the whole civil rights movement. And in 1957 the civil rights division was created. And so it has responsibilities as well to enforce those laws. In addition to all of that, of course, the FBI was created in the earlier part of this century. And of course the famous name associated with that is Hoover. But the FBI is underneath the Justice Department. The Drug Enforcement Administration
that's becoming so important.
Is underneath the Justice Department. The Immigration and Naturalization Service is under the Justice Department.
That also is incredible.
The Bureau of Prisons, the federal prison system, is under the department. We manage the prisons. The United States Marshal Service. Now, the United States Marshal Service was created, I think it goes back to 1791.
That goes way back,
It goes way back. It is under the Attorney General as well. So what I'm saying is all of these vast responsibilities have been created. They really reflect the growth of the country, its needs, its interests. And we do today have quite a unique department.
Yeah, and as the government itself grows, greater responsibility devolves down upon you. You said before the antitrust that you were a law enforcement agency, really in a sense. Is it fair to say it's a law enforcement, the leading law enforcement agent in the world, in the country is the Attorney General, or his responsibility for that? And is there within that, it's an attorney, it's not a matter of an interpretation that is devolving down upon of what the law is, it's a matter of the enforcing of the law in the name of the executive branch of the government.
What you have here, in fact, Justice Rehnquist used to work here at this building, and he wrote a law review article back in the late 60s when he was here, in which he observed that from one administration to another, the enforcement of the laws remains constant in almost every case. He said, though, that there might be 5% of the cases in which there might be some discretion in the way a particular law might be enforced. But by and large, it's like a river, just runs right on, and the responsibilities are the same from administration to administration.
Except, of course, new things come. Drugs.
New things come.
Tremendous focus in the nation has been focused on that lately, and that's all devolving down upon upon ultimately down here upon in the federal sense here at the.
That's right, but not only that. In recently by statute in the earlier part of this decade, the Congress created the National Drug Enforcement Policy Board. And named as chairman of that board the Attorney General. Now, sitting on this board are the representatives of the various government agencies that have responsibility for drug enforcement. Now, the DEA is under us. We have the criminal division that also prosecutes. The FBI has now joined the fight against drugs. But those are not the only ones represented on this board. We also have the Customs Service, which is located at Treasury. We also have the Defense Department is involved now, just to a limited degree in the drug battle. So there are a number of government agencies that are now involved with the fight against drugs, and the Attorney General is the chairman of this board.
Yeah, but in terms of this carrying out of the law, it's the major law enforcement agency goes right from the beginning of the Republic and up to the most. But it grows with the growth of the system, the growth of the country.
I should mention that of the 65,000 people we employ, we have about 5,000 who are lawyers.
A lot of
it's
lawyers
the largest
here, right?
law firm in the world. But in addition, it's the largest investigative firm, you might say, because the FBI and the DEA, these people are investigators. Then we have prison guards, we have prison wardens, we have the Marshal Service, the people who transport prisoners from here to there, who have responsibilities in all of the judicial districts out there. We have the INS, Border Patrol agents. They have a certain investigative, if you will, function, a certain patrolling function. So we do have quite a few law enforcement responsibilities.
And it is a law enforcement responsibility. If we look outward from the federal structure, which is vast and growing despite efforts in some parts of some to see if we couldn't cut back on government within our society and so forth. It is a growing enterprise, as it necessarily must be, so that you would have law enforcement as it relates to the society in broad general terms, but it also has oversight responsibility in terms of the functioning of governmental perhaps malfeasance or anything else that would go on within government at a state and local level. So that also is part of the responsibility, and that gets a little confusing to some people sometimes.
Well, for example, there are instances sometimes of police brutality. There may be instances of corruption by public officials. The drug business, for example, we have discovered a number of instances of corruption of state and local officials.
Probably,
It's our responsibility to prosecute where there have been violations of law, and we carry that out all the time.
Yeah, no matter where that violation is. If it brings into the corridors of government, then it would bring it in then.
An interesting fact, back in 1982, in that fiscal year, under this administration, we brought more cases under the criminal civil rights statutes than had ever been brought before in any previous administration.
Is that a true fact?
That's right. In other words, instances of police brutality against minorities, or instances where we have, in fact, we've had instances of slavery in this country.
Slavery?
That's right. Peonage, if you will, where people will bring in maybe an unsuspecting or illiterate group of people and make them work on a farm, virtually enslave them. I mean, this is against the law. And we prosecuted more instances like this. Or, for example, another example would be cross burnings, Ku Klux Klan type activities. Or another instance would be, we had a case out in Kansas City where a black jazz musician who used to play his instrument in the park, a group of youth set upon him, beat him up, killed him. We prosecuted in that case and convicted the people who did that. Those are the sorts of things that we did, and we have brought a record rate of prosecutions in that area.
Yeah, it's interesting in itself, and also that you're maintaining the civil liberty, civil rights kind of legislation has been passed as part of the responsibility. Enforcing that has been part of the responsibility here at the Department of Defense, as well as all of these other things. If it comes into the government, the investigative, as it were, in terms of the government activity and so forth, it even came at the time when at the time of the Watergate and so forth, they were even investigating the federal government at the very highest levels, and they were involved in carrying that out as part of their constitutional responsibility, and created a constitutional crisis, as it were, at that time, by carrying out the mandate, right? But that is the mandate of them.
That's right.
If there was any kind of malfeasance within government, even at the federal level, it would be up to them to investigate.
There are contemporary examples. There is an Independent Counsel Act, of course, which gives discretion or gives the opportunity to actually prosecute a case to an outside counsel if there is perceived to be some kind of conflict within the government. And there have been several different episodes in which we have handed off a case, if you will, to an independent counsel. There have been about 5 or 6 now under the law, and that was a law that was passed in the wake of the Watergate era.
And the Watergate was an incredible traumatic experience. The nation went through at the time of Watergate, and the Justice Department was very involved in that at the time, weren't they? I mean, because you had Attorney General.
I was not here.
No, I didn't say that you were, no, but I'm just saying as part of the judicial, evolution and the evolution of the judicial process and the federal process, that was an incredible experience where the Attorney Generals and the special prosecutors and so forth, that all had responsibility here, and they do then have that oversight responsibility to the structuring of the whole society, not only outside of the government, within the governmental process process itself to make sure that the law is interpreted.
That's right.
Not interpreted.
Enforced.
Enforced. That's an
right.
important distinction, isn't it? To make sure that the interpretation of the law is still within the judicial branch of the government and so forth.
Although I would make one point. Every officer of government takes an oath to uphold the Constitution.
Yes, indeed.
Every officer of government here at the Justice Department, as well as in the Congress, as well as at the Supreme Court, as well as at the White House, we all take an oath, and we all must comport ourselves consistently with the Constitution. For example, if the President has before him legislation that in his judgment does not pass constitutional muster, he is enforcing the terms of the Constitution as he sees it if he vetoes that legislation. Now, every president has that responsibility in the exercise of a president's pardon power. Now, the Justice Department has an important role because the Attorney General, he wears many hats, but one of the hats he wears by statute going back to 1789, one of his original two duties, is to provide legal advice and opinion to the president.
There's not a counsel? He doesn't have a counsel? I mean, all right, I'm sorry.
Right.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
And he does that all the time. And he has an actual office of legal counsel that helps him in that responsibility of providing the president with legal advice and opinion.
That's an office of legal counsel within the Department of Justice.
That's right.
Advises the president apart from the president's counsel.
Well, no. What happens, the Attorney General is the one who has the function of giving the advice and counsel.
Okay.
The Attorney General can't do everything.
You know, I was going to say.
Just as he can't sit here and give you this interview.
Yes, right.
Just as I do that.
Right.
The Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel assists the Attorney General in the advice-giving function to the President.
Oh, I see, and that's a large responsibility
It's a huge responsibility.
because they have to understand the legal structure, the structure of the system itself becomes more and more complex all the time. It's difficult enough for the citizens to try to get some sense of that, and it's difficult for the people within the government to understand as events happen so very, very quickly. Things are changing, the system is changing so rapidly, the infrastructure of the country is changing and so forth. It's hard to keep up with the changes. You said before, it's been an evolutionary development of the federal structure, including the Justice Department, throughout all of that, and that continues more and more rapidly. New challenges, new areas of opportunity and challenge present themselves to you, such as, for instance, this increased emphasis upon the drug question. That must have been a very large thing that's evolved down here, and other things.
The drug issue is an interesting issue because the drug issue traditionally has been perceived of as strictly a law enforcement function. That is, we have tried to target the supply of drugs. The theory being that if we can reduce the supply of drugs through prosecuting those who traffic in it, those who bring it in the country, that we can ultimately solve the drug problem. But we have ultimately recognized in this administration that if we're going to be successful in this fight against drugs, that we have to not only focus on the supply of drugs, but also on the demand.
Education, all right.
Which means prevention and education. That's right. And this Attorney General in particular has been very adamant about that, and he has insisted that it's important, and the President has, the First Lady has, it's important that we give people the facts about drugs, about the pharmacological dangers. And of course, the death of Lenny Bias, the death of Don Rogers, this country certainly galvanized the country to take more action in this area.
And that educational activity is part of the function of the Department?
And we do that.
That's
Absolutely.
part of the function of the Department of Justice, and to educate rather
as a matter of
enforce
fact,
only. Right?
As a matter of fact, the Drug Enforcement Administration is involved with sports athletes, with Dave Winfield, the New York Yankees, for example, in trying to present to young people information about drugs. My office does a great deal of that as well. In fact, we have prepared a videotape that's available in the high schools across the country, and to other interested parties with teenagers 14 and above.
Yeah, the nation has really become to focus on that issue, and it's changed so from what it was at one time.
That's
There was
right.
a much more lax attitude.
Well, I think that people are beginning to realize that drugs can have dangerous effects, and that we have to do something about it.
Yeah, they have. Mr. Meese has also taken attention on the pornography, or something. There was a pornography commission.
That's
was that something that he's given? That's another area of...
Well, the history of that, if I may just briefly explain that, the President himself in 1984 asked then Attorney General William French Smith to put together a commission to study pornography, it being 14 years ago from that date in 84 to 1970 when the last study by the federal government had been done. And so Attorney General Smith put in process this commission, and when Attorney General Meese came on board in 1985, he inherited a project that had been started. The commission was impaneled and it went to work in the spring of 1985, and it concluded its work in the summer of '86. Just recently, the Attorney General announced what his 7-point package or program would be at the federal level to deal with obscene literature
Yeah,
and
that's
materials.
one of the many things that he has to be concerned
That's right.
with. National security and the ability to maintain national security standards and to prosecute if necessary and to find and safeguard national security.
That's
Major concern?
Well, it is a major concern.
Yeah.
Just this year at the Department of Justice, we've had a number of spy cases, the Walker case being perhaps the most celebrated. But constantly we're dealing with issues involving national security. We're involved with terrorism issues, as everyone knows.
Terrorism is another thing that's come into the vocabulary of the world in the last
That's
decade
right.
or so in a new kind of way.
You know, one of the interesting, in fact, what you say raises an interesting fact about the Justice Department. It is increasingly an international department. Now, we have DEA agents who are in various places around the world, who do work around the world in cooperation with foreign governments abroad. And this indicates the international breadth of our work. But this Attorney General, for example, I have been with him 3 times this year to Mexico. We have quite a bit of involvement with the Mexican government over issues of mutual concern. This Attorney General has been this year to Europe to talk to some of his counterparts about terrorism. He has been through Southeast Asia, and he's been to Rome talking with his counterpart in Italy. We have quite a few relationships abroad. In fact, one of our efforts deals with treaties.
Yeah, and the terrorism thing has come out. We've got terrorism, we've got Gaddafi, we have all kinds of terrorist things. Terrorism is a word that really going to need definition in the broad general sense, because one person's terrorism is another person's freedom fighter. It gets very confusing, and the people want to have some sort of a clear understanding of what that is. But the responsibility of make sure national security and that there not be leaks, the question of here we're in television, the question of leaks that would be got out, that would be detrimental to the national security by the media or other things. This is a question that wants to be guarded against, to make sure that there aren't unauthorized or inappropriate leaks and inappropriate kinds of attacks or something of that sort by the press that would be in support or in touch with other elements of the world that increasingly feels the United States is their enemy or something.
Sure.
Of that
Well,
sort.
I think that there are many responsible elements in the press. In fact, I was reminded in your comments just there of an interview that NBC did with Abu Abbas, and NBC was criticized, in fact, by a number of people in the media for its interview because it did not disclose where that interview took place.
And they said they couldn't because they would have to. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that the debate that you mentioned is something that rages inside of journalism itself, inside of the media itself.
Yeah.
What is the appropriate way to deal, to handle, to cover, and report on terrorists themselves?
Yeah, and how can national security be defined in order to make sure that it's not just people who are at the time of Watergate, but the national security concern was voiced in order to safeguard the position of people who were within the government and so on, and to make sure it's not. So you're in a certain sense between those two things,
in fact,
and have a great responsibility for maintaining the free flow and integrity of information in the society, both within and outside of the government.
Even as we sit here today, the President will have a news conference tonight. One of the subjects of that news conference undoubtedly will be Iran.
I should expect.
And the situation with the hostages and what the President did do. And also in respect to what the reporting requirements are with the President.
The disinformation thing with Libya came out recently.
Yeah, well,
there was inappropriate tales being told.
Well, the fact of the matter is...
Is there anything culpable within the government that would fall in your view to try and...
Well, as a matter of fact...
You're saying what I'm saying? I mean, from the public perception.
Well, if we can take one subject at a time. With respect to Iran, the National Security Act of 1947 recognizes that the statutory provisions recognize that there may be instances that the President, in the exercise of his constitutional responsibilities, in which, in his judgment, he need not report what he is doing to the Congress if he thinks that national security might be compromised. And in the exercise of his responsibilities, in this instance with Iran, the President did make that determination. All along, he intended to inform the Congress when he thought it would be appropriate to do so in terms of national security, and he did that, in fact, last week.
And so that's a thing, but
that is one of the ongoing kind of concerns that we have here.
That is an ongoing concern there, and then that is an ongoing concern that you would have to keep track of. And again, the idea that the Justice Department has the responsibility of keeping track not only of the citizens outside of the government, but all the citizens, because it's a government of all the citizens and the government itself, so you have to keep a
Well, let me caution you about one thing. We don't like to try to keep track of all the citizens. We believe in freedom, and we believe that people do have freedom out there.
You have to keep track of not only the people in the government,
Right.
but even the people within the Department of Justice and the Public Affairs Division of the Department of Justice. You have all that responsibility. You have to monitor yourself, even.
That's right.
Well, I'm just in a sense jesting, in a
Sure.
sense, but it's tremendous
Right.
responsibility. We could go on talking at great length, and I really am sorry. There's so many issues we have. I know you got a
Right.
busy schedule. I really thank you
Sure,
for having
you
taken
bet.
this
I
time.
hope this
right?
helps.
It's been a pleasure. Not
Okay.
at all. Remind you, it's been your pleasure.
Great.
Terry Eastland, the Public Affairs Officer for the Department of Justice. We do thank you very much for sharing your
Thank
time
you
with
much.
us. Right?
Appreciate it.
Your pleasure to have those perceptions. Please stay tuned. There'll be more coming up in the same general topic area momentarily. That's it for now. We're coming right back. Mr. Eastland, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed. Coming right back. Welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where we're very pleased to welcome to the program Mr. Leonard Boudin. And Mr. Boudin is the General Counsel with the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee. And Mr. Boudin, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Glad to be here.
We do want to talk about the contemporary situation in terms of the national political scene and so forth, and perhaps some answerability on the part of the administration for recent activities. But I wonder, preceding that, I wonder if you might share with us a little bit the historical development of the emergency itself.
The National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee was created in 1951 by a group of American liberals, including I.F. Stone, a great journalist, Corliss Lamont, Ted Thackeray, the publisher of PM, and Clark Foreman, and also Palmer Weber, all people who had been devoted to scholarship and civil liberties. The organization was created because there was a vacuum in civil organizations willing to protect people against the onslaught of what today we call McCarthyism.
It was an amazing era, wasn't it?
It was an
in its
extraordinary
way.
period of hysteria. And the other civil liberties organizations, like the American Civil Liberties Union, now a fine organization, were caught up in the hysteria and were unwilling to protect people against the onslaught of McCarthyism. And so the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee not only engaged in educating the public, but was available to represent all kinds of people who were the subjects of oppression at the time by the government, and brought a number of test cases in the Supreme Court, many of which we won, establishing, for example, in the Kent and Briel case, the constitutional right to travel, in the Julian Bond case, the right to be a legislature despite your opposition to the Vietnam War, and in the Lamont cases, among other things, the right to receive mail from so-called communist countries. So all in all, although there were defeats in the courts, the record was a very good one of the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, and today it's directing its attention to a variant of those old themes.
It's interesting, isn't it, in a certain sense, and it's instructive, perhaps, that we need have the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, as it were, by citizens groups such as this. It would be thought that within the and it's often the case when one is watchdogging, as it were, the government itself, because there is the Justice Department, there is the structure of the government itself, which is supposedly in position to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed, and that if there are cases of culpability should be monitored by the governmental process itself. But sometimes that breaks down within a national hysteria.
It has to break down when it is the government itself.
Yes, well, that's
the difficulty. We've had, that is, I have had, not the committee. I've been representing the Socialist Workers' Party now for 13 years in litigation directed against the illegal practices of the FBI, break-ins, burglaries, wiretapping.
Now, those things are supposed to be monitored by the government itself, but that problem is a little tricky.
Precisely, and we have been suing the government for 13 years because of the government's illegal activities. So there always has to be recourse to some other watchdog, a private watchdog like the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, or the American Civil Liberties Union, or the NAACP.
Because the checks and balances of our constitutional system, in addition to which we have the fourth estate, the press, and so forth, seems in many instances not to be adequate to keep a faithful watch upon the maintenance of security for our national civil liberties.
I think that is quite true. And fortunately, in this country, unlike even England, we have a very good written constitution.
Indeed.
And we have a very important function served by the judicial system to protect the rights of citizens. Virtually none of the things that we can do now in going to court could be done in England or in France.
That's right. That's right. We have these kind of things where these things can be tested, and you have been doing that sort of thing, and feel this approach is appropriate in terms of the contemporary moment in which we find ourselves. We live rather in an extraordinary time in terms of the relationship between the citizenry and what has been a very, very popular administration among the American citizenry and so forth. But it's rather an extraordinary time, and one that's worth having a good perspective upon, isn't it?
Yes, and I think past events sort of illuminate the present and the future. The situation today is very different from what it was in the McCarthy period, when individuals were driven out of the government, out of public employment, out of private employment, blacklisted, denied passports, and hounded, really, many of them to their deaths.
Were you ever? I have a list.
Were you ever? Exactly. And the McCarthy list expanded and contracted and expanded as to who it was who was a communist. And the loss to the government in that period, to the people of the United States, of those valued civil servants was extraordinary.
Yes, indeed.
We drove out hundreds of thousands of people. And that explained in part why it took so many years to recognize China. Ironically, of course, through Nixon.
Yes, indeed.
But Nixon built his career, and so did many of the other people, upon the danger of communism, including the danger of, quote, red, quote, close China.
Yeah, right. We had that feeling. The McCarran Act came out of that with its threat of, which we still have holdovers of, it's still in the books.
Oh, yes, it's still on the books and still being enforced in the visa field, for example. But today the situation has a different kind of evil empire, if I may use a phrase, used in another connection. It is a period in which the executive branch has seized power and has corrupted it. And we have the most obvious example in the Iran Gate or the Iran Amok, whatever we call the current situation. And it's, in my analysis of the current situation, it's difficult to determine what particular category of wrongdoing should have priority in our analysis. Is it that the president has engaged in 3 armed conflicts, Libya and Nicaragua and Grenada, exactly, without the authority of the Congress? Is it that we have had a government by junta, a small group in the White House, very much like the plumbers of the Nixon period, a small group that disregarded the functions of the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense,
and the act of Congress saying that these kind of things were not to be done specifically in Nicaragua.
Exactly. Now, and then you have the third category: has there been a defiance of congressional statutes? Then you have a fourth category: has there been essentially a cover-up? Well, it's very difficult to determine which is the worst thing the administration has been doing since 1981.
And are we talking about culpability on the part of them in the face of the Constitution structure? And if we are there to be, in some manner or means, answerability for culpability created on the part of the administration and or the president? And do we have procedures that are going to bring that question before the public in a proper way? Or is it just going to be forgotten and go down? Do you understand? It's like...
Yes, I understand perfectly.
What are the procedures that the citizens have in order to have their government and its representatives be answerable for wrongdoing?
Well, if we look back at Watergate, there were procedures there, and those procedures, to an extent, are being followed now. That is, there was a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, followed by a successor after the Saturday night massacre. That special prosecutor engaged in criminal prosecutions. There were a number of congressional committee investigations. Those committees held hearings. Then a few years later, we had the Church Committee investigating the intelligence agencies, which have been used and misused by President Nixon. Today, we have a repetition of that. we have at least one major special prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, engaged in investigation of the criminal activity here. We have congressional committees very vigorously and carefully, I believe, investigating the matter before public hearings. But when you talk about culpability, I think we are missing the point, not you, but we are missing the point, the American public, if we concentrate on people like North and Poindexter. Because I'm really not concerned, so far as the future is involved, with a criminal prosecution against an individual like that. The problem really lies in the administration itself, in President Reagan, actually. And when you talk about methods of handling the problem, there is, of course, the possibility of impeachment proceedings being brought against President Reagan.
Yeah, that's been brought up.
It has been brought up.
And are we seeing a situation which could bring impeachment? Is that an appropriate approach that we could consider? And if so, what would be the steps that our nation would go through to bring that process?
Well,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're making good points. Let me begin by saying that, unlike many other people, I am not sure we've reached the point where impeachment should be sought. Impeachment is, of course, brought by the House of Representatives, and if it decides that a president should be impeached, it impeaches him, but that only leads to a trial by the Senate. And the Senate is the one that can remove a president or any officer of the government from office. Now, I do not believe that we are at the point where impeachment should be secured. I have proposed in an advertisement published by the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee in the Times that this litany of misconduct on the part of the administration calls for the resignation of the president. And I've said in that advertisement, was published in the Times, that I thought that the president could win back a great deal of respect from the people of the United States and from the world if he were to take the step of resigning now. I would include, by the way, Vice President Bush.
Now, that in itself would be a traumatic and huge event if it were to happen. Your ad was in the paper some time ago. Since the Tower Commission report has come out, the president has had another press conference. Things seem to be on an even keel. They're standing tall again, things to be moving ahead, so that it seems to be that he isn't in a mind, or the administration is not in a mind. They think that the public is becoming bored with the whole thing. We'll just go ahead and have a great last quarter, as he put it, in terms of his presidency. And so that notion of his being voluntarily resigning, as it were, seems not to be something that's on their agenda or their thought pattern.
I don't think it's ever been on their agenda. I was really interested not in reaching the president, but in reaching the public, and having the public think about, in a careful review and a very cool review of what the president has done, to think about whether we really need to have a president of this kind in the next year or two. You know, as I review what the president has done, first of all, he came into office determined to destroy the government of Nicaragua. It was not as if he came into the office, he made a study of the problem, and then decided that Nicaragua was a threat to world peace or to Central American peace. No, he came in, and in 6 weeks after that, he directed the CIA to come up with a plan to overthrow the government of Nicaragua.
Also Libya. He targeted Libya with distruths and disinformation right from the beginning about that country. But anyway.
I don't know whether we remember today that it was the disinformation program that first brought Poindexter to the attention of the American people.
That's right.
And here he is. He turned up a little later. I thought the Libyan situation was, well, how can I say it was more aggravated than Grenada or more aggravated than Nicaragua, but it added a new component to the situation. The president engaged in the bombing of Libya without following the procedures required of consultation with Congress under the War Powers Act.
Right, and in retrospect, also taking evidence of a bombing in Berlin that supposedly was laid at the hands of the Libyans, which later was found not to have been in their hands. And on the back page of the New York Times, it said it was more likely Syria. So
Syria
100 people
or Lebanon.
100 innocent civilians were killed in that raid, and they were still taking that as a mark of standing tall, and yet it was really a despicable act of, it was a breach of international law.
Oh, it was a breach of international law, and it was a violation of established, we thought established, executive policy of this country that we would not attempt assassinations. And it seemed very clear. I read Seymour Hersh's very good analysis of the Times the other day, indicating that our objective was really to kill Gaddafi. Quite extraordinary thing, because one of the things that church investigations brought out in 1975 were the attempt of the United States government, perhaps successful in one instance, to kill the leaders of other governments of whom we disapproved.
I wonder if I could just put a point in here. You said that the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee was made up by a group of liberals, so that the liberals will have a certain political agenda that would be, of course, an objection to generally the philosophy of what we have now as a conservative government. So when we're talking about the culpability or the answerability on the part of the administration, to make sure it's not just a matter of saying, well, we disagree with their political views and their philosophy and they ought to be ousted. That would be the purview of an election that we have coming up in 1988. But what we're talking about are breaches of a constitutional system to separate it out from just a political opposition. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's
yes. What I have said in the position of the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee is not intended to further an economic program or a program which disagrees with the basic domestic policies of the president. Our interest is limited to the Constitution of the United States.
In this 200th anniversary.
In this 200th anniversary. And that, by the way, is why so many people and groups have now been asking us to talk about McCarthyism. The anniversary has sort of highlighted the need for the protection of the Bill of Rights.
And yet we do have a different situation now than we did then. I mean, the threat to the Constitution of the system, in a broad sense, is different, perhaps, or the expressions of it are different than it was, as you said before, in 1950. It isn't quite the same.
No, it's not. It's different from what it was in 1789, and it's different from what it was in 1950. We have here an accumulation of power over 200 years in government as such, which was not contemplated, of course, by the people who wrote the Constitution. Government is very complex.
Tied into the military establishment.
And tied in, as President Eisenhower pointed out in this famous phrase, to the industrial military complex.
George Kennan talked with Mr. Cronkite last night and noted that the military complex is so established in the government they seem not to be able to bring it under civilian control. Almost it's a danger. You're talking in terms of juntas and so forth.
Precisely. As a matter of fact, junta is a familiar expression of a military takeover in Central America. And it's very proper to call a White House group a junta today. I'm interested, and the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee is interested in only one thing, in the Bill of Rights and in our Constitution as a whole, in which the executive branch does not take power away from the legislature.
And that has been occurring.
And that has occurred. The Boland Amendment prescribed activities in Nicaragua. Those activities continued not only by the CIA,
covertly,
but by the National Security Council, and by North, and by the President.
And with the knowledge of the President, and with, if not a nod and a wink, even the approbation, as it were.
I believe there was much more than a nod and a wink. As I read the Tower Commission report, which is a very elaborate one, in which I think every American ought to read, if he can wade through
bestseller now,
it's a bestseller, wade through those details. I think one is impressed by the fact that this was a White House program, and it was not a program of what we'll call a rogue elephant or an individual like North. I have no doubt that North was following the instructions of Reagan and of President Reagan.
And were the things that they were doing, Mr. Reagan and Mr. Ray, and the things that they were doing, the answer comes around that and other things. Is there answerability in the sense of bringing it back to the idea of there being a major change in terms of our political structure, such as resignation or the bringing of some sort of trial or impeachment?
Okay.
Where is this process leading?
Well,
we were talking before about the committees. Where do we stand as citizens so we can understand the answerability that's going to be
for one thing,
demanded of the system?
Far broader than the question of of individual responsibility, although I'll come to that in a moment, is what changes ought to be made in our basic government policy. Number one, we should not have covert activities directed at other countries. If you have a war, then it's a war that's declared by the Congress, and a lot of things go in times of war declared by the Congress. But you should not have the executive branch deciding to have secret presidential wars.
It's very dangerous.
It's one of the most dangerous things in our system. The second is that you should not have agencies of the government, like the National Security Council or the CIA, doing things on their own. They should be subject to surveillance by the Congress.
Well, they are meant to be, but they tried to get around those kind of things because the Congress wouldn't approve of what they were doing. So
exactly, but I think that many people in the Congress probably knew what they were doing, and while I would concentrate upon the president, I must say that I think Congress has been delinquent over the last few years.
Back again to that problem of our overall system, everyone being in bed together, as it were, needing agencies outside of the established system, even including the press, in order to keep the system online, as it were, because a lot of people are in bed together with the system that, you know.
And the press, of course, was kept out of the Grenada invasion.
Yes.
An unprecedented move. And the press remains a terribly important institution. Now, you are directing yourself, of course, to the immediate remedy. I think that ultimately Congress will be presented with a resolution for the impeachment of the president.
You do?
I definitely think so. I've read the Tower Commission report, and I followed the activities of President Reagan since he took office, particularly in the Nicaraguan situation. Which brings me, of course, to another point. We are a government of laws. The International Court of Justice rendered a decision. It held that the United States government, the Reagan administration, was violating international law and our treaty of amity with Nicaragua.
Mining the harbors?
Mining the harbors, aiding the countries, writing a psychological manual for anti-humanitarian acts by the countries.
Including assassination?
Including assassination of civilians, of judges, of mayors.
Terrorist activities.
Exactly. And the administration has failed to obey the order of the International Court of Justice.
They've turned their back on the concept of international justice as a concept, which is perhaps more damaging in a world which, if ever needs an extension of the rule of law into the international realm, it's now.
As we have moved into the nuclear age, and as governments have become more powerful, large governments and small governments, we must all depend on the rule of law for domestic and international survival. When the United States tried its preemptive strike, using an appropriate metaphor here, against the jurisdiction of the International Court, 3 days after Nicaragua filed its complaint, it violated the rule of law. When it withdrew from the proceedings before the International Court, it violated the rule of law. When it disobeyed the International Court's decision and continued with aiding the countries, it violated international law. And when it notified the Secretary General of the UN that it was withdrawing from its general submission to the International Court of Justice of international disputes, it violated the rule of law. I think you've made a point there. I think on the international scene, we are in greater danger because of what the administration has done than even we are on the domestic scene.
And there's a closer interaction between the foreign policy apparatus and the domestic questions here. Emergency Civil Liberties Committee has been concerned with domestic policy, but the international foreign policy and domestic policy are interwoven, so these things too interrelate. You said earlier you thought that the process is perhaps going to work and that bills of impeachment are likely to be brought. What would be a likely scenario, and could you tick through again the congressional hearings and so forth that are going on, and what would be a scenario that we might be able to think over these next, it would be an extraordinary 2 years if these kind of things were going on. What would be your...
Well, I think the congressional committees are going to develop facts, pretty much as the Irwin Committee did in the Watergate period. Those facts will reveal, in my view, I think they already have, the involvement of the President of the United States and, to some extent, of the Vice President of the United States. a congressman or a group of congressmen will introduce a resolution, pretty much as was done in Watergate, calling for hearings before the House Judiciary Committee on the proposed impeachment of the president.
Has that has not been advanced yet? It's premature, or
I think that some people have advanced it already.
Ted Wise,
I was the one who thought it was somewhat premature. Then
it's a large act. I mean,
it's a very large act.
It's not to be taken cavalierly.
And one of the difficulties, of course, is that people are saying, well, we've suffered enough through the Nixon period, through the Watergate hearings. Why do we want to go through it again?
Well, it is traumatic to have the whole presidency brought into question. So it's a traumatic event, and it's not done lightly at all.
No, I don't think it should be done lightly. It's one of the reasons I say move very slowly, but move forward.
Well,
as the Supreme Court said in Brown against
we have so many.
Education,
Yes, I'm sorry.
With all deliberate speed.
Yes, we only have so many months until the end of the presidency. I'm sure they would like to be able to just sort of ease it on through and get through to it. And then the attention of the nation is going to be taken up with the election soon, and they'll be saying those who are in objection to them can throw the rascals out in '88 if they want, and that sort of thing. So whether or not these other extraordinary events would be actually taking place, we ought to be, in a sense, aware of what the procedure would be.
But what concerns me is that the president may engage in a violent act, an attack on another country.
Xenophobic kind of...
in an effort to rally the American people.
Hit Libya again, maybe.
Perhaps.
Or something.
Or engage in much more activity in Nicaragua. That concerns me, and it seems to me that the earlier the facts are brought out, and possibly
might rein them in a little.
Exactly, might rein them in, and that they ought to be brought out in an impeachment proceeding. Remember, the House impeachment proceedings, if they result in a decision by the House of Representatives, don't remove the president.
No, it takes it over to the Senate.
Requires the Senate. And then the Senate would have to have a hearing presided over by the Chief Justice.
If these were to occur, when would these events occur in a scenario? We're now talking in late March of 1987. What would be the scenario? Also, what would be the role of the government itself? The Justice Department would have a role in that. They have a responsibility for investigating a wrongdoing or maintaining the justice system, not only of the general citizenry, but even on into the people in the government itself. And yet the Justice Department is overseen by Mr. Meese and so forth. What would be the role and the structure of the system? What would be the actual events that would emerge?
Well, in a congressional committee hearing, ordinary hearings are to be held, the various witnesses will have their independent counsel. I don't think it would be proper to have the Department of Justice represent them, and they are not, in fact, represented by the Department of Justice. When it comes to the turn of the president, then I'm not sure whether Attorney General Meese can properly represent him, or whether he should not have special counsel, the way James St. Clair represented President Nixon. When the congressional committees begin to subpoena records of the president, from the White House, there may again be a battle, such as there was in the Nixon period. I'm inclined to think not. Incidentally, one of the problems of this whole thing is that I don't think that President Reagan kept written records of any meaningful character the way President Nixon did. And so you're going to be relying upon oral testimony and upon proper inferences to be drawn from the activities of the whole group around President Reagan. But to continue with the scenario, if the House of Representatives votes to impeach, then you have the hearing before the Senate. And that's the hearing that President Nixon avoided by resigning. It is at that point that I think it possible that President Reagan will resign. But I'm not sure, obviously. We've been talking, by the way, about the press and about the reaction of the government and the public. I was very disturbed to read in today's Washington Post the great humor at the Gridiron Club meetings of the president, and a very favorable story told about how all of these people joke about their own wrongdoings, but in a very easygoing way. And there was a reference made by the president at one point to Bitburg, where he visited the Nazi camp. And it really seemed to me to be terribly inappropriate for the press to have this jovial encounter with the president, in which, well, we forget about all the terrible things that are done. We're really all pals.
Well, that's part of a thing he's had going for him very well. He's been jovial on a personal basis. He's a likable person to the press. He's been able to get political amity. I mean, a good feeling with the press, people in the Congress, so forth. He's a likable person. He's not, as Mr. Nixon was very much disliked by the press in a certain sense. So it's a question of popularity in a certain sense. I've talked to some people about what might be emerging in the question of impeachment and so forth. They say, well, the political content, the feeling of the people within the Congress, within the press, within the society in general, he's had an enormous popularity over his long term. So the feeling of the nation would be to try not to face up to the idea of there being culpability that could lead to impeachment. And it's not really a question of whether or not it's something that would be a politically popular thing or something people would like to do. It's a question of maintaining the law and having answerability for wrongdoing within the context of rule of law.
Precisely. The press, I think, has to rise above its natural desire to get along with the president.
Yes.
And a natural desire that is enhanced by the fact that he is a very amiable person.
Yeah.
There's no doubt
Likable,
as to that.
yeah.
He's likable. I was appalled by another thing that happened the other day. During the hearings, during the argument on Lieutenant Colonel North's fight against in court against the special prosecutor, when he sought to declare the special prosecutor's functions illegal or unconstitutional, the story that appeared in the press had two interesting aspects that nobody has called attention to. The first was that Circuit Court of Appeals Judge McKinnon, I don't know whether you remember that, who was one of the judges who appoints the special prosecutor, came into the courtroom of a district court judge, most unusual, because he's a Court of Appeals judge, to listen to the argument, and came over to Lieutenant Colonel North, the subject of this proceeding, and engaged in a conversation about the Marines and about baseball and so forth. Well, I was shocked at what I regarded to be an example of judicial impropriety. And then I noticed a perfectly likable man, an assistant attorney general, whose name I won't mention here, came over again to shake hands with North.
National hero.
All a national hero. And that was an element of impropriety which struck me. And what it did also was to show the aura that surrounds the president.
Yes, indeed.
And when the president declares that a man's a national hero, even though the president claims that the man did things of which the president had no knowledge, that creates a terrible atmosphere. We're all pals. And I thought it particularly improper for a Court of Appeals judge to do that. I have great respect for the judiciary, but I think they have a role which has to be kept. And it's not to be involved in trying to support publicly a presidential hero.
I wonder, the human society has been evolving now over something like a 200,000-year period when apparently the human species first emerged in terms of the broader consciousness. We come to a time now with atomic weaponry and so forth of such destruction where it seems apparently we are able to destroy the entire species with our extended technological, just within our lifetime this has emerged. We come to a time of extraordinary moment in terms of the broader evolution of human institutions. We said before, it's not just Mr. North or Mr. Poindexter, it's the president, and we're looking now at the whole continuation of the species at a major break point in terms of broader developments and so forth. Whether or not there is a problem, and it's not maybe perhaps even Mr. Reagan himself, but that if there is a problem in the world, that it is the United States of America that is in a very real sense the problem. This is a difficult thing for a nation to, in a certain sense, accept, that a major problem in the world in terms of the peaceful continuation of the species is here within the United States, and we have a job of examining our very own system with its atomic capability, its attitude toward disarmament and so forth, the militarization of outer space, that it's this country that is the very real problem, and people will avoid trying to bring impeachment or other kinds of things against the president because, in a sense, it's an indictment of our system on the world stage. That's a broader pattern. I don't know, perhaps it's reaching too far, but if we need some self-correcting kind of attitude, and the problem of the United States represents in the broader community of nations itself is one that has to be addressed by us all collectively in the interest of maintaining the species.
I think the United States, because it is a center of economic, military, and industrial power, has a special responsibility which I don't believe it's been carrying out toward all the nations of the world. We are supporting dictatorships whose approach on human rights is devastating.
Seem to have no concern for the needs of the underclasses of the world within our own society or on a world scale,
I think that's
or a vision toward meeting those needs.
Exactly. As I read, if I move away from the civil liberties field, as I read of the corporations that are now engaged in discharging their employees, reducing their workloads, see the farmers going through what I remember in the 30s.
Stumble over the homeless in New York City every time you turn around. Yeah.
I have a feeling of such devastation economically and such moral devastation on the part of the government that I am really ashamed of what our government has been doing in the last X number of years, and not merely under the Reagan administration. And I just think that there is a sense of responsibility which people have to have before they can change the executive branch into something that's workable. And the fact that we have a man as president who seems to have no heart for all of these people who are homeless and who are being destroyed, no heart for the people who are hurt by acid rain, no heart for the people who are losing their homes. That, to me, is an indictment of our society.
Indictment of our society, and that we need to, in a sense, on the other hand, one likes to think they could legitimately stand tall, because there's a great deal in the American tradition. It has been a torch to which the world has been able to repair over a long period, and so there should be a renewal of the validity that there is basic to the American system if we could but find it. It's a tremendously large task. I'm sorry, we could go on talking at great length in terms of some of the implications of this, but I'm sorry we've run out of time for this segment.
You're giving an optimistic picture, which is good to have at the end, tinctured by worry.
All right, fine. Well, thank you really very, very much. I'm sorry we've run out of time.
Glad to be here. No, people always are running out of time.
Yes, I'm sorry we've run out of time for this particular segment. It has been, again, your pleasure to have the perceptions here of Leonard Boudin, who is the General Counsel with the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee here in New York, talking about these events that these discussions that ought to be discussed in terms of the future of the country. Happy to have been able to bring you those perceptions. We're in Conversations. Invite you to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back next week. That's it for this particular segment. Mr. Boudin, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you. I'm pleased.
Not at all. Good night. See you next week.